but not us. Not us. What's shakin' bacon? It has taken many a beef cutting sessions to get to this point, and today we're making beef broth and tallow. From trash? After each time I cut beef, I take the trim and the fat and I put them into bags that I keep in the freezer. Most people would just throw this stuff away, but not us. We will extract value from every dollar we spent on this meat. I took the bags out of the freezer last night and let them defrost in the fridge. If I were a little bit more forward thinking, I would have made sure that the trim and the fat were properly separated in the bags, but I did not do that. So I am now going to rifle through the bags, clean things up, make sure that only fat goes into one container and everything else goes into the other, and go from there. The reason we're doing this is because we want absolutely no meat in our fat that we're going to render down. And that's because if there is any meat in there, then that can result in a beefy smell to our tallow, and we are trying to avoid that. There are a bunch of how-tos on making tallow. A lot of people prefer to use suet, which is internal fat found around the kidneys of the cow. We are using external fat cut off of, steaks and roasts and things like that. The two fats look very different, but both are totally viable options to make tallow from. The trim consists of mainly silver skin and grizzle, and then there is just always some meat that you kind of can't avoid cutting off with these things. And all of this holds a lot of flavor, and that's why we do things like this. We're still going to be able to extract a lot of value and a lot of flavor out of these things, even if we can't eat them, as is. So I just leave the bags in the freezer and add to them periodically as I cut beef, and then I just wait until they're full enough to do something like this. For the bigger pieces of fat, I am cutting them up into chunks because we will be grinding the fat. You can also go ahead and just cut it up really small, that'll work too. But grinding will result in a more efficient and more even rendering. Now that our fat and trim are nice and cleaned up and separated, I'm going to throw the fat into the freezer and the trim into the fridge until we need it. And then I'm going to set up the grinder in the meantime. If you watched our bratwurst video, you would be familiar with Benjamin, our stand mixer. I've equipped him with our meat grinder attachment that I let sit overnight in the freezer. Our fat is out of the freezer. I'm using the largest grind plate that came with my attachment. I tried to find the specific measurement for it, and all it said on the website was coarse grind plate. It's just the plate with the biggest holes out of the three that came with my specific attachment, and I will link this attachment below so you can see what I'm talking about. Yeah, let's get grinding. Some people run the fat through the grinder twice. With the way that this looks, I think we're cool with only running it through once. Plus, now that the fat has warmed up just a little bit and the grinder has also warmed up a bit, we have just increased our chances at fat getting gummed up in here, and we'll lose yield that way. And we do not want that. We want maximum yield for our efforts. So I'm gonna clean up and we're gonna head to the kitchen. We're ready to start rendering out our tallow. So after we were done grinding up all of our fat, I took the grinder apart, made sure to scoop out any fat that may have been left behind in there, and then I took the weight of the fat because I wanted to see how much we start with versus how much tallow we get out of that. And we're starting with right over a pound. It's like 1 pound and an ounce of fat. So we're gonna go ahead and throw that into our pot, add a thick pinch of salt, maybe like a teaspoon, and about 1 cup to 2 cups of water. The salt and the water are there to help pull impurities out of the tallow. We're gonna throw it on medium, low, check back every once in a while, give it the occasional stir. Now that we have our fat rendering, we can move on to our beef broth. Now, I know I told you guys I was going to show you how to make beef stock when I asked you if you want to see this. We are technically making beef broth because we're using trim, which classifies as meat or flesh. And by definition, broth is made with meat, where stock is made with bones. I do tend to use the two terms interchangeably. Tomato, potato. They're both flavorful liquids that you get from simmering things in water. To start our broth, we're gonna throw all of our trim into a big stock pot, cover it with water, and bring it up to a boil. Once it's up to a boil, we're gonna strain everything out, rinse everything off, and return it all to the stove, but a clean pot and new clean water. We're gonna set it to simmer and just keep an eye on it like we are the tallow. Every once in a while, we might have to skim some foam off the top. We might have to add more water if there's too much evaporation going on. We need to make sure that it doesn't boil, so keeping an eye on the heat. And that's really it. It's pretty passive. You know how when you're making stock or broth, there's that gross foam that collects on the top that you have to skim off throughout the process? The reason that we boiled the trim, rinsed it off, and replaced the water is to get a jump start on extracting those impurities out, which is what that foam is. And since we did that, that results in much less foam, therefore much less skimming we have to do. Our broth has been going for like an hour and a half now, and I haven't had to skim anything. So the pre-boiling step is so worth it. You can definitely make broth and render tallow using a slow cooker. That would be my preferred method of doing this. I decided to go with the stove today just because I thought it would be a little bit faster, but there's a lot of downtime, a lot of waiting for the things to happen that need to happen, so a slow cooker would be awesome for both of these things. There's one big differentiation between stock and broth that I want to talk to you guys about, and that is cook time. So broth needs much less cook time than stock does, and that's because extracting all the flavor out of meat takes far less time than extracting all the flavor out of bones. So when I make stock, I like to let it go for 12 to 24 hours in a slow cooker. But with our broth, we're gonna be able to get by with 2 to 4 hours of cook time. Now you may have noticed that I didn't add any aromatics, no carrots, onions, or celery to my broth. If you would like to do that, you totally can. I would recommend waiting until the last hour or two of cooking, and that's just because the vegetables don't need a super long time to infuse all of their flavor into the broth. Checking in on our tallow. This is looking good. Everything looks melted. Gonna give a little stir to make sure that everything is nice and distributed. I'm going to let it keep going for just a little longer, maybe 10 or 20 more minutes. This is not taking nearly as long as I thought it would. It's probably because we started off with a pretty small amount of fat, but I mentally budgeted so much more time for this. So that's kind of exciting. It's almost like gaining time back. Our tallow is looking ready to strain. This only took about an hour and I mentally budgeted like 2 or 3, so that's pretty exciting. I already have a setup of a bowl, a sieve, and some cheesecloth. You could also use a couple layers of paper towel or a coffee filter. I'm using cheesecloth because I have it and I think it'll be the easiest option out of the bunch. I will link below the cheesecloth that I'm using if you need a specific recommendation. We're gonna push on the chunky bits to get all of the tallow out. There is still some water mixed in here, which is totally fine. As this cools, the water and the tallow will separate. The reason for the water is not only to help draw impurities out of the fat, but also to keep the solid bits from burning during this process, which I totally should have mentioned earlier. The next step is to let this cool down and let the fat and the water separate. You wanna make sure to keep it in a large enough bowl so that once it does solidify, you can easily pop the puck of fat that it will become out. I am going to transfer this into a smaller bowl just because I don't need it to be in this big of a bowl. And then I'm gonna throw it in the fridge to let it cool down. Now I was thinking about keeping the solids and doing something with them, but they look much grosser than I thought they would, to be totally honest. Maybe the next time I make tallow, we will find a use for the solids, but today I am just going to discard them. I did see that you can feed them to dogs, but my dog has a super sensitive tummy and I'm not going to do that to us who pick up after him. So while Flynn would probably love this, that's a no for me, dog. It's been about 3.5 hours and our broth is ready to strain. We have the exact same setup as for the tallow. All of it has been washed since then, if you're concerned. But bowl, sieve, cheesecloth, same setup. Now, a couple other indications that your broth is ready to go other than just the amount of time it's been cooking is if it smells pretty intensely like whatever you're flavoring the liquid with. So ours smells pretty intensely beefy, as well as all of the pieces of trim in there are incredibly soft. So these are indications that all of what is in there has let go of everything it has to offer. We're gonna do the same thing as earlier. Make sure we push everything out. One of the advantages of using cheesecloth when you're churning out stock or broth is that the cheesecloth will help soak up some of the extra fat. So if potentially you have a fattier stock or broth and you don't want that much fat, this will help with that. As well as the fat will separate and rise to the top and you can just scrape it off after everything cools down if you don't want any fat in your final product. The towel's been chilling in the fridge for just under 4 hours now, and it is nice and solid. You might be able to see where I poked it before it was solid. It has separated from the water that was left in there, and now we are going to carefully retrieve the puck of fat and dump it onto this cutting board. I don't know why I thought this container would be easy to get this out of. Oh, yes. Come on. Okay, and we are just going to scrape this off. Whoa, I wasn't expecting it to do that. That's crazy. Scrape that off and scrape the bottom a little bit. Make sure it's nice and clean. It's so white. That's awesome. This is what we were aiming for. I want to put it in this jar. So we are going to have to heat it up again. I think I'm just going to heat it up in the microwave. You can heat it up on the stove. You can heat it up in a slow cooker. It really doesn't matter. So I am going to grab a clean, microwavable, safe container and cut this up into chunks. Throw it in the microwave for a little bit until it's liquidy again, and then we can jar it up. Liquid gold, people, liquid gold. There are a bunch of uses for tallow. I'm mainly in the market for cooking purposes, but people also make like skincare products, soap, candles out of it. You probably would need to purify it a couple of times if you wanted to do something like that. I would definitely recommend watching a video specific for rendering tallow to make like skincare products and things like that for. I also read that tallow is good for seasoning cast irons, which is great because I've got like 4 or 5 that are in desperate need of a good re-seasoning. That's gonna be an all-day affair. I'm not looking forward to it. But I did do some research on if tallow was okay to use on cast iron, because I know that's one of like the old school ways to do it, but I was really afraid of if I did that, then the tallow going rancid. But as long as the fat is heated properly during the seasoning process, we should be good. Another thing the internet said was that tallow was good for conditioning wood. I would not recommend that, and I am not gonna do that because in that regard, you do run the risk of it going rancid, and that's just not a risk I'm willing to take. So for wood, I would recommend just sticking with some food grade mineral oil. So if we assume that these 2 jars weigh about the same, and I subtract the weight of this jar from however much this weighs, then we can get an approximate amount of how much tallow we got from our original amount of fat, because I forgot to weigh this before I poured it in the jar. And I'm not pouring it out and creating another dish for myself. I'm not doing that. So according to my approximate calculations, about a pound of fat gave us just under 3/4 of a pound of tallow. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. There you go. Beef broth and tallow, made from the stuff that most people would just throw away. This was many, many months in the making. So this is incredibly exciting for me. And I got rid of 3 bags out of the freezer. Granted, I'm about to replace them with 2 jars, but that is besides the point. For storage, like I just said, I'm just gonna label and date these and keep them in the freezer until I need them. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something. If you did, please leave us a like, a comment, and subscribe for more bartending and butchery content. And until next time. Oh well, lighting come back. These pieces are effing cold. Protect my hand. That's gonna fuck the audio so much. It's gonna get loud up in here. Please don't get stuck. Please don't get goopy. Just run directly through, please. I am slippery now. So I did a Flynn hair, just like in the wind. Someone took our recycling bin again? That's not cool. Don't steal people's recycling bins. Please fit, please. Yes, yes. I love that. Oh man, I was supposed to weigh how much this was. Dang it. From a bar. It's like 9 p.m. I've been doing this for a long time. I gotta say thumbnail now. I don't really have a lot of thumbnail ideas. I have one. I have a single thumbnail idea.